us into a discussion of modernism and the whole idea of how art and literature was changing at the turn of the 20th century, because today we're going to talk about 20th century poetry, modernism, and postmodernism. So I included this famous image in the background of modern art because it's the perfect depiction of what modernists were trying to do. When we think about the 20th century, we usually break that into two periods, right? Like, so we look at the first 50 years or so of the 20th century, and then we look at the second half of the 20th century. So we have basically in the first half of the century, maybe a little bit less modernism, and then we move into postmodernism in the second half of the 20th century. And one of the things that modernists were really focused on was making everything new and different. They didn't want to kind of continue the same types of thinking. They wanted everything to be an experiment in something that has never been seen before. And you can understand why at the turn of a century, people would be starting to think about that. Oh, all those people were, you know, stuck in a tradition of writing a certain way or painting a certain way. And we're going to experiment with the freedom to do things that are more modern. Every generation wants to do that. So same thing, music, same thing with all of the artistic endeavors. So when we look at a painting like this, this nude descending a staircase that's behind me, it's not really behind me, but you know what I mean. Then we can kind of see how they're trying to take the really representational art that we're used to seeing, you know, where it really looks like a person walking down a staircase. And instead, he's envisioning that the person is in motion. And the person is represented by these blocks of, you know, sort of texture. And then that person is descending down. You can see that they're, you know, going, it's hard, going that way down the stairs. And so I wanted to, let me share my screen. I wanted to kind of touch on that today as we're talking about modernism and postmodernism and use that as a touch point. On Tuesday, I went over the qualities of modernist literature. We also talked about the final exam study guide and discussion number 9, which is the last one. That one's due this Friday. So today we're going to move into talking about modernism in 20th century poetry. And you can get the booklet that just has the poems in it here, or also on Blackboard. Let me see. It's in the unit. It's kind of ridiculous to me that we're reducing all of the 20th century down to 5 poems and 2 stories, but that's how this course works. I could do a whole course just on modernism. But if you go to additional materials, then you can get, oh, maybe I didn't put it in there. I guess I didn't. I think it's here though on the calendar. If you click here, you can have the same slides. Yeah, that I'm going to be going through. So let me start with sort of the basics on modernist and postmodernist literature and how you can tell the difference between them. So when we talk about modernist literature, there was probably a shift between the 2 wars from modernist to postmodernist. Modernist is a little bit more hopeful, playful, because it began before the First World War and the effects of the war, like we were talking about on Tuesday. So you have movements like imagism. Imagism is a really important movement from the time, and it includes poems that are very short. Imagism is usually a snapshot moment where we just get one image and that's it. And so we can understand that that's only going to be a few lines. And that's a direct sort of effect of the idea that modernists had to make it new. They don't want to write like the Romantics. They don't want to write like the Victorians. That seems old-fashioned to them. They're coming into a new century. Technology is increasing at a rapid rate. And so they wanted everything to be up to date and modern, not old-fashioned fuddy-duddy like their parents and grandparents. So make it new was sort of the catchphrase for modernists, artists, writers, all creatives during that time. And so they consciously tried to break from the traditions. And so sometimes you'll see paintings that are modern paintings if you go to a museum or in a book or something, and you'll be like, oh, that's weird. It doesn't even look like anything. It's just two blotches of orange or whatever. And it's because the artists were trying to break out of that traditional shell and try different things. This is where we get a lot of more free verse poetry. We get people who are trying new things and trying to make it new. So re-envision your art to be something that nobody has ever seen before. We also see the influence of psychology in modernist literature because that's a new thought pattern. The idea of psychology is a new field. And so people are kind of thinking about the internal struggles and elements of psychology that they've never really thought about before. After a while with modernists, kind of leading into the 1920s and 30s, it takes sort of a dark turn because of World War I. And I was talking about that, of course, on Tuesday. But the horrors of war really made people start fearing the future. What is the future going to be like? If this is what it's like now as a result of World War I, what else, could be so destructive on our society? Just the sheer destruction with the weapons that were mechanized now for the first time, and the bloodshed, the carnage that happened as a result. So the second part of the modernist movement in the 30s, 40s is pretty dark and cynical. Postmodern kind of starts in the second half of the 20th century, sort of after World War II. And this is a focus much more on politics, social change. If you just think about history, even in America, you know that in the 1960s, there were protests and people being more socially conscious about things that were happening in government, in politics, in the world, in society, and culture. So this is where we start to see writings that deal with political and social change. Critical lenses start to be a thing in the postmodernist movement. We studied critical lenses in this course and last semester too. So that's a way of thinking about literature in a new way, going back to Shakespeare, going back to the Romantics, and thinking about what different ways we can view that work from a more modern standpoint. Then also, I think I would probably put a star by the last two over here on this column, and that is there's danger in a single narrative. In the second half of the 20th century, people started to become more aware of how perception differs and that there are a million shades of gray in any situation. So that means that looking at something from just one perspective is dangerous because there are other perspectives from which you can observe that same thing and have a more well-rounded view of what it is. Postmodernists also have concern over the idea of the universal, the idea that everybody has the same approach to morality. People have different religions, people have different viewpoints, and we have to kind of start to understand that. A lot of the literature that we've read up to this point assumes a very sort of white, European, Christian viewpoint. And in the second half of the 20th century, we have a movement toward more voices, more ideas from different cultural backgrounds being observed. So there's more concern over the idea that everybody has the same experience when there's a human experience, but there's also varying experiences depending on your culture and your background and your morality and your beliefs and all of that stuff. So all of that stuff feeds into postmodern thinking. Are there any questions on that? I'll take a screenshot of that and put it just like I did with the Victorians, and I'll put it in the Blackboard under additional materials. I don't see any questions, so let me go to the poetry for today. I think there's one missing from here. I was going through it before class, and I don't see the Imagist poem that I wanted to put in there. I might have to go back and amend it. Yeah, it's not there. I'll go back and put it in, and I'll show it to you before we go. Okay, so let's see if we can find some examples of those things in the poetry selections that I've selected for you for today. One that we can look at is The Glory of Women. Siegfried Sassoon wrote this in 1918. Well, it was written in 1917 and published in 1918. And he was a World War I soldier. And so this poem is a depiction of the horrors of war, but deeper than that, it's about the conflict between how community and society looks at war versus how war really is, written by someone who was in that trench warfare. So this poem is sad because it talks about how you love us when we're heroes, you worship decorations, like you like to have these big parades with us wearing our dress uniforms with our medals and all that stuff. But what we had to go through to get those medals in war, you cannot even comprehend. And that those medals are representing something different to the soldier than what they're representing to society. So he says, you make us shells. That's a really important, I want to highlight that in a different color, because that's a really important sort of dichotomy. You make us shells. Well, I don't know what the footnote says, but you make us shells could refer to the fact that factories started making ammunition for some of the weapons. There were a lot more mechanized weapons so that more destruction could happen more quickly. So people back home did make shells, but there's also a flip side to the meaning of that line. You make us shells, meaning that when you look at us only as the ribbons and the achievements of our glory, you turn us into shells of people who don't have a soul. You know, you're just worshiping the decoration, not what it took to earn that decoration, because you don't want to hear about that. You want to hear about the ugliness of war. So you make us shells is kind of a pivotal line there. He says, you can't believe that British troops retire or retreat when hell's last horror breaks them and they run, trampling the terrible corpses blind with blood. So he's kind of giving a little window into that war situation for the actual soldier. Oh, German mother dreaming by the fire, while you are knitting socks to send your son, his face is trodden deeper in the mud. So he's trying to bring that conflict of society's perception of the soldier versus soldier's reality and that conflict. So I'm hoping that you can see the qualities of modernist literature there, the horrors and fear, the cynicism. It's a very cynical thing to think of people in a shallow way like that, but probably it was the reality of the soldier. The next poem in the packet is by William Butler Yeats, and in this one we see the sadness of passing love, passing life, sort of like the realization that we're all getting older at the same rate. Even though I'm 52 and you're 17, 18 years old, we're just farther down the continuum. We're all getting older at the same rate. And so it starts when you're old and gray and full of sleep and nodding by the fire. Take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep. So you'll look back over your youth. And then there's sort of like a reflection on that. How many loved your moments of glad grace and loved your beauty with love, false or true. So we look back over our lives, and then this is about a particular love because you have a shift right here. But one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face. It is sort of a hallmark of people when they're older to have nostalgia and think back over their lives and it happens to all of us. But it talks about how love fled and hid his face amid a crowd of stars. So there's this sadness quality that we have here, this in leading into the 20th century there. Do not go gentle into that good night. You can tell by the date of publication here is moving into postmodern thinking. So this is a VNL. The structure of it is repetitious. A VNL, I highlighted in yellow here all of the repeated lines, but it's about the night, but the night here is sort of like death or the loss of hope. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Those two lines are repeated throughout the poem, and that's the structure of a VNL, which is a new form in the 20th century. So you have this repetition emphasizing the main point, and then both of them are together in the final couplet here at the end. So this poem is about how you should fight against the dying of the light, and the light could be a metaphor for life. It could be a metaphor for hope. In other words, don't just go out peacefully, go out kicking and screaming and trying to hold on to another day of life or another ounce of hope. And so the poem is structured not just in a VNL form, but also with the types of men who sometimes struggle to not go gentle into that good night. And then finally, it dwindles down to his own father, as his father is old and dying. So you could see the postmodern elements there. Blackberry Picking by Seamus Heaney. I don't know what year this was published, but it's toward the end of the 20th century. This poem is a narrative poem, and it has the element of telling a story because it talks about how we, in other words, it's a first person collective narrative, we would pick blackberries when they would ripen and we would eat them. And, you know, in the summer, they were so tasty and, you know, we had this craving for them. And so we loaded up every container that we could find, and we went and we picked them all and left them in the barn. We couldn't eat them all. And then what happens, there's a shift, and all of those berries, before they can even eat them, rot. And there's a rat gray fungus glutting on our cache, and the juice is fermented. And he says in the ending idea, I always felt like crying. It wasn't fair that all the lovely canfuls smelt of rot. Each year I hoped they'd keep, knew they would not. So that's the sort of philosophical ending to the poem. The rest of it's sort of narrative, but obviously this is a metaphor for how things that are so joyous are sometimes, as we get older, just memories. And you can kind of get foreshadowing in this first part of the poem. He talks about the blackberries ripening, and at first just a glossy purple clot. Clot is not a word that we associate with pleasantness. And then he says that summer's blood was in it. And so there are these images of blood and that sort of are sprinkled in the first part of the poem. There's stains, there's a reference to Bluebeard who killed his wives, and their hands are sticky with the blackberry juice, but it's compared to the blood of Bluebeard on his hands from when he murdered his own wife. And so blobs, there's words like that that give us a little foreshadowing that it's not going to be only glorious in this poem about blackberries. So we have that same idea that, you know, trying to maintain hope. I wish that they would stay, right? It wasn't fair that all the lovely canfuls smelt of rot. Each year I'd hope they'd keep, knew they would not. So they still went out the next year and got more blackberries and more than they needed, and they still rotted. So the action of going back out again is still a hopeful one, but they already know what's going to happen, is it's going to take a turn. And I guess you could extend that in postmodern thinking to the idea that most things take a turn, and it's difficult to maintain the positive and the hopefulness of life, and that is depressing. But as you grow up, you realize that that's true, and you have to find your own ways of trying to make that happen. You know, I wanted to show you one of the ones I wanted to put in this pack, and it didn't make it in here for some reason. I probably messed up when I was cutting from the PDF. Is Station at the Metro. So Ezra Pound was an American writer, but I wanted to show you an example of Imagist poetry. I'll go back and amend that PDF so that it's in there, but this is the poem, right? This is an example of Imagist poetry because it's just one little snapshot, and this is from the modernist movement. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So it's a metaphor, right? Looking at the faces in the station, in the train station, they look like petals on a black bough, and that's it. So it's about this image, this one image, that's why it's called imagism, that is striking the author. And that's it. It's just like, I always remember one of my professors talking about imagism and saying it's kind of like if you're sitting in a room and there's a door to another room that swings open, you can just sort of look in there and then it swings closed. And you only got that one little glimpse, and that's Imagist poetry. And so that's one of the forms of making it new, right? We haven't seen anything like that. Shakespeare would never, right? So it's kind of like now we have this new type of poetry. We have a more modern sense of free verse. And what if this poem is only 2 lines and only one image? And all of those possibilities open up for more possibilities. So are there any questions about, let me go back to the screen here, modernist and postmodern literature? No? All right, well then, we talked about essay number 2 on Tuesday. That one is due this coming Tuesday. I have been getting emails from people who are asking me to read drafts. Some people, give them some feedback on them, things that they can work on before the finals due. Some people are refining their topics and asking me for advice on that. You don't have to ask me for any advice, but I want you to know that I'm available if you want to shoot your thesis over to me, if you need sources, etc. You can certainly ask me to do that. Something came up in second period on Tuesday that I wanted to address because I just want to put it out there about JSOR. So I'm going to click on the essay here real quickly. I have had a few emails, and then in 2B, we were talking about searching in JSOR, and some people have had trouble and emailed me. I'm having trouble finding an article. When I do a search, thousands and thousands of things come out, and it looks like some of them don't even apply. And I just wanted to make a note that searching in JSOR is not like searching in Google. In JSOR, you have to do a Boolean search. I can spend a minute talking about that if you want, but if you're searching on JSOR and you're getting like 6,000 articles when you search, it's because of the way that you're searching. And that's why last semester I was asking, do y'all know how to search in JSOR? Because it's different from searching. Do you want me to talk about that for a minute? Or are you all okay with your sources? Because I don't know, I asked if everybody know how to do JSOR, and maybe I'll just take a second to do it, because even if you're not asking me, maybe I'll just show you anyway, because people don't like to identify themselves as needing help or whatever. Okay, yeah, thank you, Armin. Going through life, you're gonna have to get help from people all the time. Life is not a single player sport. And I know that it's hard to think that you have to ask for help, but you're gonna do it your whole life. So It's good if it's being offered to you to just ask. So on JSTOR, when you log in, hold on, let me. The tendency, I think, is for people to just like type in right here. Let's say I'm going to do my paper on the contributions that Shakespeare made to literature. Some people will just type in here like Shakespeare. Well, how many results do you think I'm going to have? 235,000. Now notice that it's giving me a suggestion. The author, do you want me to look for stuff that's written by Shakespeare? It's saying, do you want me to look for things with Shakespeare in the title? Do you want me to look for images? What do you want me to look for? But let's just say I don't specify, right? 130,904 results, 10,000 images. Well, I'm not going to use the images in my paper, but that is a lot of results. So I want to show you the thing to do on JSTOR is to do an advanced search. And what it's called is a Boolean search. A Boolean search is when you tell the database, I want you to look for this keyword and this keyword and this keyword. And I want you to find articles that only have those 3 keywords in them. Right, so say I put Shakespeare, and then over here I put contribution or influence. And then I can add as many of these little search things as I want to. Let's just put English like that. And I'm gonna do another search. All right, well, look, it came down to 41,664. That's still a lot, but it would probably be a little closer to what I'm looking for. So Shakespeare, influence, and English, I want to narrow that down even more. So now I'm going to go back here. I think you can just add it up there, but just to demonstrate, I'm going to put Shakespeare. And I'm going to use the tools that they have here. I don't want them to find Shakespeare as the author, as the title, in the abstract, and the caption. I want Shakespeare to be in the title of the article. Like I want it to be about Shakespeare. And I want the articles that it finds to also look for English. And I want it to talk about, let's just say language. How did Shakespeare influence language? And I want that word to be in the title too. Or I could say I want it to be in the abstract, which is the little summary that you read before the article starts. Or maybe I know the name of the author. I could search for that if I found it somewhere else and said, oh, I want to find articles by this person. But I'm going to put item title. So now it's going to look for Shakespeare and language in the title of the article and English anywhere in the article. And I'm going to do a search. Let's see how many we get. Oops, I don't want another box. I just want to search. $100. So by narrowing down, and I can even go back and I could change, see how it's got title here, and I could add more features if it's not narrow enough, or I could change. And what if I want to put in like influence, and I can decide I want it to look for that too. And so the more search items that you put in there, the more accurate the search results are going to be. Hopefully that makes sense to you. I would have gone over this earlier, except I say stuff in class like, do y'all know how to do a JSTOR search? And nobody says anything. And so I think, oh, okay, everybody knows how to do a JSTOR search. But then people were starting to ask me questions and I thought, well, let me just demonstrate it. By the way, you can do that in a Google search. There are advanced ways to search for Google. One of the things that you can do is, if I type Shakespeare, I don't know how many billions are going to come back on Google, but say I want to look for a certain phrase. You can put quotation marks around it. So if I don't put these quotation marks, Google's going to go look for any website that has the word Shakespeare, has the word influence, has the word English, and has the word language. It's going to ignore the word on. That's going to be billions. But if I put quotation marks, that's a search string. So that means it's going to look for any page that has the name Shakespeare and the phrase influence on English language. So let me hit the search and see what comes up. I don't know why. It did this yesterday too. I don't know why it's giving me some sort of German translation. But look, how did Shakespeare influence the English language? What did William Shakespeare, what's his contribution to literature? So by putting that phrase in a search string and telling Google, I want you to look at this as a whole chunk, not as separate words, I'm getting a lot better results. There are 150,000 results, but the first ones are going to be, you know, my most relevant responses, right? So that's just a little bit of, you know, search techniques. There are others, but I noticed that people were getting exasperated with having a thousand responses returned when they were searching on JSOR. So hopefully that will help you if you're still searching for sources. Okay, so discussion 9, the last one, is coming up this week. Essay number 2 is due on Tuesday. Also, Tuesday we'll talk about Virginia Woolf's The Mark on the Wall, which is a short story. I think it's maybe 6 pages. It's not very long at all. And then we'll look at the short piece of fiction, which is a little bit longer, The Garden Party, on Thursday the 6th. At that point, I'll probably also ask you if you want to talk about the exam. We have class, our last class day together is next Friday. If you want to, we could have a review session for whoever wants to come, or we could just talk about the review on Thursday and not have class on Friday and you can study. I don't know what will work best, but we'll talk about that next week. But you should read The Mark on the Wall for Tuesday. That's a big day because the essay is also due on that day, but some people have already turned it in. So I'm assuming some people are working ahead and making sure that they're using their time because they probably have other things going on in their classes. So any questions? Anything else I can go over before we finish for today?